Welcome back, King of Kings family, to another episode of Beyond Sunday Sermons. This is where we take a recent King of Kings message, kind of unpack it a little bit further, take some of those tasty nuggets that we didn't quite get to in the 35 minute message, and get a chance to further expound upon them and get some other people's thoughts on them. So we've got a couple really experienced, knowledgeable people with us today, and Mike's here too.
Yeah, I'm here too.
Yeah, first of all, Mike White, the Director of Ministry here at King of Kings, a man who has no shortage of takes. Mike?
Excited for the topic today. Let's do it.
And joining us is Amanda Wood. She is the Director of Student Ministry, but more importantly, she is the mother of quite possibly the most adorable child.
Wow.
Definitely on staff, but maybe in the world. So why is Finn not here today? That's the big question.
You know, I will admit the cute factor in Finn's 100%, but the helpful factor, not so much. 18 months old, he would have a field day in the studio, and
you don't think
we'd get nothing done.
You don't think he has a lot to add on pain and suffering?
Oh, tons.
we have two kids as well. They're not adorable at all, Dan. Are they beyond?
You've seen Finn. You know. Noah's adorable.
So back to the topic.
Yeah. So pain and suffering. All right. So that's actually, in all seriousness, that is going to be our topic today. And it's one of the most commonly brought up things, I would say, just talking points in the church is, how can a good God who loves us allow pain and suffering to exist in this world? And I thought that Tim Keller, who is the author of The Reason for God, he posed it in a really interesting way. He said, given evil and suffering, if God is all-powerful, he probably doesn't care enough to stop suffering, so he's not loving. Or, if God is all-loving and wants to stop suffering, then he must not be powerful enough to do so. But if you have an all-powerful, all-loving God, which is what the Bible says, then there shouldn't be evil, but there is evil, therefore that God cannot exist. So I know that was a mouthful, but let's start there. Do you guys think that makes the case in either direction that there can be an all-loving and an all-just God?
So right in the deep end.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, we're diving in.
Yep.
There's no softballs here.
I've heard that a variety of ways phrased, and it's kind of the perfect question, and it feels like there's no way out of that question. But I think it's the wrong place to start. So I would say people are assuming there's a good and bad. Like, where does that come from? Because if there's just evolution, like I don't know how you get there. And then what it does is it puts pain or pain-free living as the ultimate value. And I don't think that God created humanity with that as the ultimate value. I would offer that I think experiencing love and love relationship was God's ultimate value. And if that was ultimate value, following that has to be the possibility of pain and suffering.
Yeah. I think it's a super convenient quote, right? Like, it'd be great if we didn't have to have suffering, but we also not get free will? Like, there's that whole dilemma. And so I think what we're going to get into today, what we'll see is it all comes back to, what do we believe about the nature and character of God? Like, who do we believe he is? And what do we believe we deserve? And so kind of where's our identity in all this lie? But I think pain has a huge benefit in our life as much as it sucks in the moment. And so I think we're going to see, as we dive deeper into this, that there's beauty in it.
What's the beauty in pain?
I mean, I think we see from Scripture that it produces perseverance. I think if I look in my life personally, the seasons of pain or suffering in the moment reaped really great closeness in my relationship with God and my relationship with other people. It allowed me to rely on other people. And I know it was super hard to see that in those moments for sure. But I know God uses all pain and suffering. Now, does he cause it? I don't think so. But we might be getting into that later. I don't want to get ahead of us.
Yeah, I guess I'd also not want to start and diminish anyone's pain and suffering. So
for sure.
Just know we're going at this from a theological standpoint. It can be wisdom and when you use theology or nature of God too. Yep. And I think Christianity gets pinned down with this question a lot, but every worldview has to explain it somehow. And I think we actually, as Christians, have the most comprehensive answer for pain and suffering.
And what is that?
I think it's a value thing, like I said before. I think God chose that love is the ultimate value. Trinity existed, Father, Son, and Spirit in relationship before creation, and then humanity was the outflow of that. And so God desired love to be experienced and expressed in relationship, not just marriage, but community relationship, church kind of relationship. And so for that, there had to follow freedom, like Amanda was saying. And if there's freedom, there's the possibility of pain and suffering.
Right.
So God could have created a very pain-free world. Then what would the converse be? Then I think we'd be robotic. We wouldn't have emotions or be people in some sense. So I think that if God could have said, this was my ultimate value is pain-free living, and I think in America we're seeing that more, and that I think later, but then there are consequences if you say we're going to mitigate any and all pain or the possibility of it, then we're not humans is what I would say.
Well, I think you bring up a good point there. If we don't know what pain and suffering or just harmful circumstances are, then can we experience love? Can we experience joy? Like, I don't know. Maybe it's possible, but it seems like there has to be that contrast. You have to know what the opposite is to be able to experience the good effects as well. And yeah, Mike, you brought up a great point. I want to be very clear. Like, as we go through this, we're not going to try and minimize anyone's. If you're going through something right now and you're listening to this and you're just like, these guys are just taught, this is not helpful. This is purely from a theological standpoint. I know that definitely at a lot of funerals, that people love to come and say, oh, well, God is using this for a good purpose or something. Like, that's the worst thing that you can say to someone
100%.
that's grieving. So we're not trying to come at it from this angle at all. Hopefully we can, provide a little bit of insight and direction overall. But if you're hurting, don't think that we're just trying to cover over that in any way, shape, or form. So in John's account of the Last Supper, one of the final things that Jesus tells the 12 is, in this world, you will have trouble. So Jesus, obviously, he did not promise us an easy, pain-free life in any way, shape, or form. Yet, Mike, you kind of alluded to this, especially as Americans, we kind of like have this entitlement that like we expect that. Why do you think that is?
I think it's the growing infiltration of the American dream into the church. And we keep moving towards more and more comfort and pleasure and away from pain and suffering and hardship. And so I think that's encroached on that. But Jesus is very clear in Scripture, and it's like the worst marketing plan ever, right? He's like, come follow me.
Follow me. It's going to be really hard.
Sacrifice everything.
Take up your cross.
Closest family and friends are going to reject you, and you might be killed. Like that's what he says and puts out there to have his disciples come follow him. And they do, and they're transformed, and they give up their own well-being for a greater purpose,
Yeah, I think we hate pain. Like, look at our culture and look at all the things we do to avoid pain, avoiding boredom through scrolling, avoiding feelings through eating, like anything we can do to avoid pain. And I think, honestly, it comes back to like acknowledging whatever you're feeling. So in the moment in our life, we're trying to avoid boredom or frustration, whatever. But with God, we're trying to avoid the fact that we have a role in suffering, that our brokenness and our sin has a role in the situation we're in, and owning up to that is uncomfortable. So why not just point it back to God? Well, if you're loving, you wouldn't have me go through this. I think it's just an easy avoidance tactic.
Yeah, I think a lot of life is about expectations. And so we have this expectation we place on God, and it is to be pain-free and not to suffer. Yeah. I would also say that God is not pro-pain or pro-suffering.
Sure. Yeah.
That wasn't God's design. But again, it's not his ultimate thing. I think its purpose is transformation. It's the gospel message being proclaimed in love relationship.
Correct me if you guys think that I'm wrong, but I would argue that suffering only exists because of our sin. We brought that into the world. If we lived perfect lives, there wouldn't be suffering. So do we deserve to suffer? What do you guys think about that?
Deserving to suffer? I mean, yeah, I think freedom brought that into existence. Deserving is an interesting word, but I think when we throw out, like Keller's question is perfectly framed. I've heard that so many ways, but it's at this like high ethereal level. But if you look down to the breakdown of pain in our own lives, I mean, how much is it because of my own choices or those who are close to me?
Right.
That's the majority sure, there are natural disasters or
Right.
whatever else happens, but that's like the exception to pain. I mean, most of it's because of my choices or
Right.
those close to me that hurt me. So like that's where pain comes from, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think of it more in the realm of parenting. Like, I feel like my world was blown apart when I became a parent because I finally got to understand a tiny aspect of our relationship
To the
with
most
God.
adorable child
On
in
the
the
earth.
whole world.
Except for Noah.
But I want to protect my child, but I'm not going to stop natural consequences sometimes. If he goes to touch a stove and I tell him no, but he does it anyway, like, there's a natural consequence. And so I think our brokenness, our sin, it elicits natural consequences. And so does that mean, does Finn deserve a burned hand? No. Gosh, no, I would hate that. But it's a natural consequence. And so I think that's kind of the situation we've ended up in.
That actually makes me think of a really interesting parallel to exactly what you said. Tony Dungy, who the Super Bowl winning coach for the Indianapolis Colts.
Which Amanda knows all about that,
Yeah.
right?
No big deal. Pretty good football team. Well, not anymore, but they used to be. But anyway, one of his sons has a condition that he was born with where he can't. I don't know if this is still the case, but when I read his books many years ago, when he was a young child, he could not experience pain.
Oh, wow.
So if he smelled like cookies being baked, he would be like, hey, I want a cookie. He would go open up the oven. He would take the tray out and he would just eat the cookie. And he's burning himself, but he can't feel it because he doesn't feel the pain. So yeah, he's not experiencing pain, but his body is still suffering. Pain is actually would have been good for him in that moment. And I think that there are areas of our lives where that's true, where we're doing things that are hurting us, maybe not even physically, but certainly spiritually. And God's got to rattle the cage a little bit and say, hey, man, I love you. I want to bring you back. So I'm going to use something that you don't like to try and get you back where you need to be.
Yeah, I've heard of that condition before, and actually feeling a little bit of pain prevents even more pain.
Right.
Yes.
But that exact thing. So actually feeling some pain can prevent you, you know, or turn back to God, like you were just saying there.
So Jesus came down. He endured the worst punishment humanity could possibly throw at him. He experienced separation from the Father for the first time in existence. If he loved us enough to suffer for us, then he must have a good reason for it. Does Jesus' willingness to suffer, in you guys' minds, justify the existence of suffering?
I mean, justify is interesting too. I think, again, it goes back to the fall. I think it shows a unique God that other religions don't have. I think you see in Hebrews 2, I think it's 17 and 18, and Hebrews 4, where it talks about a high priest who's able to sympathize with all of our weaknesses. Like he wasn't aloof and distant and far away. No, he gave up heaven and came in the flesh to an impoverished teen couple who was unwed. And he lived in obscurity. He was a blue-collar carpenter. He was rejected. He was abandoned. He went through excruciating physical pain, right? I mean, it shows the nature of our God who can relate and resonate with anything that we're going through.
Yeah, I immediately thought it's backwards. Like the presence of suffering and our role in the cause of suffering in this world, it justified Jesus needing to suffer and needing to pay that price that we could never pay.
Yeah, the willingness to enter in shows the nature of God
Yeah.
is huge. Doing to whatever length to bring back a rebellious people.
Mike, a couple of years ago, you had a really informative and I thought was really good Hot Topics seminar on pain and suffering. Nice synchronized drinking there, by the way.
We just figure while you're rambling
Yeah.
on, we'll
Very
just hydrate up and just keep unified team over here.
You had a quote in there, and you've touched on this a little bit today, but I want to get into it a little bit deeper. You said, we are shocked by suffering because our Western and Christian mindset believes that we deserve zero suffering. What is it about like the Western mindset, and especially in America, do you think has allowed us to have this thinking that suffering is something that we should be free from?
Yeah, I'd probably say it a little differently now, thinking Western and Christian. Like, I don't think it's actually an accurate view of Christianity. I think it's kind of that whitewashed, sanitized, it's all about me and my well-being, and it's just not. So I think people get misplaced with Christianity. And it's hard. I can't speak authoritatively as an Asian culture expert or African or whatever, but I mean, you've seen more of the world than I have. I mean, they're in pain and poverty a lot. I think it's just kind of a natural part of their life, whereas it's hard to speak for the average American, but I just don't know if the average American goes through pain on a consistent daily basis or worries about where's my next meal coming from. But But poverty and lack of food and clean water and stuff like that, that's what millions of people, billions of people deal with on an everyday basis. So I think they're just more in tune with pain. It's just a natural part of their life. I don't know. Well, you've seen more than I have.
Yeah, I've gotten to do a lot of traveling, missions-based traveling, and just seeing people living in poverty or just living really difficult lives who are just so content with what they have. There's a lack of entitlement in other countries. And I think thinking about this American dream, like I'm going to work hard for a few years and then I'm going to retire and do nothing. And I think our culture is just brought up in such a moralistic way. Like, hey, if you're a good person, if you do good things, you deserve good things then in return. And so I think it keeps bringing us back to like a works-based faith. And so if we believe that we get into heaven or we connect to Jesus by being good, then why do we deserve suffering? Because I'm a good person. When that has nothing to do with our faith. Our faith is just based on God's generosity and Jesus' death.
Yeah, I think that our comfort is not at the center of God's will. Like that's not his main desire for us. And we get that confused and we think it is.
Yep.
And then when we have a hardship or suffering, then we're like, where's God? If he's perfect, if he's omnipotent and all that kind of stuff, why isn't he giving me comfort? So
that's good. Amanda, you used this phrase earlier, and I want to get into it a little bit. You said there's a difference between, maybe you didn't use this exact verbiage, but something along these lines. There's a difference between God causing pain and suffering versus using pain and suffering.
Right.
What is that difference?
Yeah, I think thinking of it in that lens of parenting again, right? Like, it's one thing for me to take Finn's hand and put it on the stove and say, hey, don't, like, see what's going to happen if you do this. This is going to be the result. I'm causing this suffering so you'll learn. Like, I'm using it. It's different to then say days after, man, I'm so sorry you burnt your hand. But when we look at this, like, what can we learn from it? Like, using it to teach him and help him grow. I think about my life, and my biggest kind of moment of suffering in recent history was the birth of my son. And I had a really terrible infection that I could say, God, why'd you cause this? There's nothing I did. No one related to me that made that happen. But for some reason, I ended up with really severe infection. And in the moment, I was totally in that place. I was mad. I was frustrated. And looking back, I just feel like God taught me a lot about himself, a lot about me, and just kind of gave me a dose of humility of like, it's not all about you. You know, like I think our whole life is just so much entitlement and like what is best for me in this moment, what's best for my family. And I think sometimes pain and suffering allows us to zoom out and see like God's will is for him, it's for his kingdom, and we're a part of that and we're his kids. But like you said, like his central focus is not our comfort. And so I think he's going to use it to teach us and grow us, and it's going to look different for every person in different seasons. But I do believe he uses it.
I think it's the value of knowing Scripture and seeing the character and nature of God.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we get in this entitlement mode because we don't know Scripture and who God is.
Yep.
And I think he does have times when he brings justice and what we might call pain. But he's not malicious. It's not like fly off the handle and emotional and responsive and reactionary. It's to cause judgment for people to return back to him because they were seeking other things, which is death, and he's the only source of life.
Well, not too. I thought about earlier as we were talking, like God talks about disciplining his children that he loves. And so I think part of this is our personal relationship with God is asking him those things. I've had seasons in my life where I've had moments of suffering, and I do believe God was disciplining me. But I'm not going to go up to someone and say, you have this season of suffering because God's disciplining you. That's between you and God and what he's revealing to you.
Yeah, I think it's hard to parse out what's causation of just the world or my sin or brokenness or whatever versus God introducing pain and suffering into something. But I think that's the Hebrews 12 passage about that. And good parents do have boundaries and discipline in the same way God has that with us to shape us and mold us and keep us in his will.
But yeah, I think as you guys mentioned, it's important to note that not all pain and suffering is disciplinary.
Definitely,
If there's an earthquake and 6 million people die or whatever, that's not because God is mad at that country or they did something wrong. Again, we can't explain why that pain and suffering is occurring, but it's not because we just have this angry, wrathful God who's sitting on high, throwing down thunderbolts. So I think what you just said, Amanda, there really resonated with me. I know probably one of the most painful seasons of my life was probably 4 or 5 years ago now, I had probably about a 6-month season of unemployment. And there's a lot of rejection in that time, a lot of emails saying, no, thanks, we don't want you. You don't have the skills to do, or we don't think that you're capable of doing what we need you to do. And just that was a really, really hard time. I don't think I've ever felt less worth in my life. But looking back on it, I mean, I think God used it to kind of iron out some of my work habits that I was using before, definitely made me more diligent. And B, he used that time to, I've never been closer to God. I mean, I had nothing to do. All of a sudden, I was in my Bible all the time. I wrote a book during that time. Like, he used that time. In that moment, I hated it. And I was mad at him, and I was frustrated with him. And I was just like, God, what is the point of this? Help me out here. Throw me a bone, man. And looking back, he was throwing me all kinds of bones. And that's not to say that all pain and suffering, like a couple of years later, it's just going to be like, oh, now I see how God was working. It doesn't always work like that. But so many times, if we're able to scale back a little bit and see the big picture, you can kind of see how God is moving the chess pieces to do something really cool.
Right. Yeah, I really think of Romans 11:33 doxology. It's a prayer just talking about God's wisdom. It says, "Oh, the depth of the riches of the wisdom and knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. Who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor?" Like, we just can't begin to understand the complexities and how the world works. And so just boil it down to like, why am I in pain? Like, it's just such a simplistic view of our insanely majestic, creative, intentional God.
Yeah. Old Testament talks about his ways are not our ways. His thoughts are not our thoughts. I think we put ourselves on the level of God and want to understand. But that's the purpose of knowing him and his character and his word. And Dan, I know you referenced Romans 8:28. We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. And it's not that all things are good, but he's able to reshape and repurpose all things. Unemployment, horrible child birth story. I know I've had that with my mom dying in high school. I know my daughter being born with hearing loss and like uncertainty with that. It just really strips everything away, and you rely on God in those moments. So I think if we allow God, it will grow us, it will shape us, it will draw us closer to him. And I think so many other arenas we see this in sports, working out, like it's hard and it breaks you down, and you rely on team, those sorts of things, but you grow stronger because of that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think of the common phrase, like, if it's not good, then he's not done. But I think sometimes we forget that might mean in heaven. Like, it might not be good until he comes back, and that's hard. But we have to believe that in his goodness, it will be made good by the end.
Yeah, we just have a different hope. There's that Romans 5 talks about suffering produces perseverance. Then it talks about hope. And I was listening to Tim Keller's sermon, and he was just saying how Christians died and had hope. They knew they could actually forgive those who were killing them. They could go back into cities that had plagues and stuff like that because they realized this isn't our world. So to live differently, they have hope beyond pain and suffering and circumstances. Like you're saying, it may not end or resolve or be neat. I mean, I think almost all of us are going to face death unless Jesus returns. Like, there's going to be some pain and suffering that we're all going to face at some point.
C.S. Lewis actually had a really interesting quote that I think kind of ties into what we're talking about here. He said, "God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscious, but he shouts in our pains. Pain is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I think he has to shout because we let our pain be really loud. Like, I think about in my most painful moments, I got to have somewhat of a pity party. Like, sometimes I'm like, all right, I'm going to need a couple days. I might need a couple, whatever it is. I think we need to lament. We need to feel that pain. But I think he is shouting. And I think if we want to listen, it will wake us up. But it does rely a little bit on our response. Like, he can shout all day long, but if we don't turn to him and engage with that, then we might miss out on some of the good he's trying to do.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the American dream and self-sufficiency. But when everything is stripped away, who are you going to rely on? when it's comfortable and good and I have a job and I'm married and I'm healthy and my kid, whatever else, it's like everything's great. I don't need to rely on God.
Then you
Right.
rely
But
on
then
self,
someone's in
yeah.
pain, not saying he introduced that necessarily. I see beyond myself and that I can't be self-sufficient.
So, Mike, you had another quote in your Hot Topics. There it is. I'll find it. Hot Topics, where you said, God is a just God, but he's compassionate and loving, and he never wastes pain. I agree with that. I just want to open up and say, what evidence do we have of this to somebody who's going through it right now? What evidence do we have that God doesn't waste pain?
I mean, that's a faith step right there. It's a word of God. I mean, I think you can experience it and live it out and see growth in hard times or whatever it might be, but there's no tangible proof outside of Jesus coming in. I mean, I think his word, his promises, those sorts of things. That's the Romans 8:28. In all things, he works for the good of those who love him. I mean, I think Jesus is an example of that. Again, we kind of unpack that a little bit, but that shows his willingness to step in and put his money where his mouth is in some ways, So
Yeah, I just think of the power of testimony. Hearing what Jesus has done in other people's life, that helps us get through seasons of suffering. I mean, I think we have a handful of people on staff, people that have lost spouses, are gone through cancer, and like able to speak to the goodness of God despite those life-altering circumstances. And I think that is just, testimony. We say that means do it again. And so just asking God to keep moving in that pain and despite it.
Yeah, I was thinking about John 11 and Lazarus is very fascinating, right? The brother dies, Mary, Martha are out. They come and encounter Jesus one by one. They're upset. Why didn't you come sooner? And we know how it ends. He raises him from the dead, but 11:35 says that Jesus wept. Like what? Like this is the compassionate nature of God. He knows the outcome. He senses the pain. And the Greek word there, it's like he actually hates death in that moment. And he's weeping. So I think you're seeing Jesus' compassionate nature. Another one is Mark 9:35-38 when he sees Israel, the sheep, so they're like sheep without a shepherd. He has compassion, splagnismai is the Greek word, where it's like this guttural compassion. When he goes over Jerusalem, about to be crucified, he sees the city that won't turn to him, and he weeps over Jerusalem. Like that's a compassionate God. And then he continues and goes, and he dies for their sins and ours. Like that's compassion and justice on the cross being played out together.
Mm-hmm. Amanda, you said something there that really made me think in that, talking about sharing in our sufferings and talking about it. Yeah. Last year, I got a stress fracture in my foot and had to wear a boot for 6 weeks. And I'm a very avid runner. It's like working out is very important to me. So being told you have to be stationary, like that was like, I thought that was the worst. And right. I threw a major pity party and I was very upset with God. But all of a sudden, everybody started seeing me in the boot. You couldn't not see it. It clunked around. It was very obvious.
Well, you were 3 inches taller too, and you're ready.
that too. It added even more height to me. But then people started telling me, they'd be like, oh yeah, I broke my leg a couple of years ago. I was in a wheelchair for 6 months. And I was like, oh, well, that doesn't sound like fun. And then somebody was like, yeah, I broke my back. I still can't run. And I'm just like, man, I'm sitting here complaining about this. Yeah, I don't like having this boot on my foot, but it's going to be gone in a couple weeks. I not that other people's suffering should make us feel better about ourselves, but I think sometimes it does help to have that perspective and share a little bit to see that, hey, we're all going through this together. It's not just, God's not just coming in and whacking one of us or whatever. It's everybody's got stuff.
Yeah, and I think it's the body of Christ supporting one another.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many one another's in the New Testament, and walking with, carry each other's burdens. We're not meant to walk alone. So suffering, honestly, allows you to lean on someone else. I had a major leg surgery in college. I had to rely on people driving me and caring for me and literally carrying me. So I think it's the church is like supporting one another in those moments.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then cool motivation to to kind of give what you've received. I know for me, being in the hospital for 3 weeks and receiving so much love and support and just different things. Now when I hear in our church someone's in the hospital, if I'm connected to them, like, let me get them a meal, let me go pop by, because I know that it's hard to suffer alone, but in community, it's a little bit easier.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just don't know if we're comfortable with suffering, but I think once you go through it, you understand what was good and helpful. And I know we talked about it before, like my mom dying, people would use these verses like at her funeral. It's like, it's not the right time.
Wrong
It's
time.
not helpful at
Yep.
all. Like
Yep.
be present, be supportive, listen,
This
ask good
sucks.
questions. This
Right.
sucks, right?
Yeah.
Maybe at some point down the line, there's time for that theology, but it's not right now. So I don't know. I think you going through suffering, then you have empathy for someone who's going through something similar or a hospital situation or losing a parent or whatever it might be. And so God teaches you how to actually minister to someone in those situations. Yeah.
Well, and looking to David, like truly lamenting with people and saying, man, I'm grieved for you and what you're going through. It's not okay. It does suck, but there is hope.
And I think the Jews have a practice called sitting Shiva, where they just come and sit for days and they don't really talk or do anything. You just kind of sit with one another and share food or whatever it might be. It's just like, you just need people with you to kind of empathize and be there with you. So.
And as we kind of wrap up here, I mean, we could talk about, this is one of those topics you could talk about all day and bat it back and forth. We don't have all day, so we're not going to do that. But I wanted to bring up a tweet that I saw as I was preparing for this podcast, and it had nothing to do with this topic, and it was just by a random athlete that I follow. Like it wasn't
Can't wait
even
for this.
scripture related.
Building this one up.
No, it was just, he just said, if God showed us the whole journey, we'd never take the first step. That was all the tweet said. And like to see that as I was prepping for this, I was like, wow, there's a lot of good truth in that. Yeah, I mean, if we knew some of the pain and suffering that we were going to have, maybe we wouldn't even step outside our house, but then we wouldn't experience all the friendships, the relationships, all the good that God has out there for us. You can't just hide. You got to step out and be prepared. Yeah, there's going to be some bumps and bruises along the way, but ultimately we have to trust and have faith that God's got our best intentions in his eyes.
Yeah, I think it's Psalm 119 that says his word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. And I don't think it was this like immense floodlight that just showed me the entire journey. They didn't have that back then, right? It was a little lantern or
Enough
whatever
to
it might
see
be.
step by step.
Step by step.
Little iPhone.
Yep, little iPhone. Grandpa light leaves it
Right.
on kind of thing, whatever. But it's just that small journey of walking with God. Otherwise, you wouldn't need God. But following him, walking with him, trusting his spirit kind of thing. So yeah, I'd agree with that. It's good. Good quote.
Any closing thoughts, guys?
Man, just encouragement. Like if you are suffering, just reach out. If you're a part of our King's Family, reach out to someone here. And if you're not, find someone in your community, your family. Don't do it alone.
It's much more compassionate than my last answer. I was going to say, not that I'm not compassionate. I just think the Christian faith.
Deal with it, kids.
No, yeah. I think the Christian faith just has the most compelling and comprehensive answer to get to this. It doesn't explain every moment of suffering or sacrifice or pain or whatever it might be, but it shows who God is, that he stepped in, that he can grow you through it and use you. And then there's hope beyond this life when there's face to face with him and no pain and suffering.
Okay, guys,
Yep.
I think we solved it.
We solved it. Compassion and some head knowledge. I don't know.
Yeah.
The unanswerable question, we just answered it. No, obviously, this is one of those topics where there's no easy answer to it, and I don't think we're going to get an answer this side of heaven, but we have faith.
Yeah.
We know that we serve a good God. He loves us, and ultimately, he has our best intentions in mind. I have no doubt of that. So, Mike, Amanda, thank you for
thanks for having
coming
us.
on the
Thanks.
podcast today. King of Kings family, thank you as always for listening and for joining us. And let's continue to live our faith lives beyond Sunday.